Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today I'm going to be doing part 3 of my updated elites tier list. So today we're going to be doing Japan, so we're going to be going over all of the Japanese elites and ranking them based on how good I think they are in general, not necessarily in this exact current meta. This is not a crafting guide whatsoever. Please do not just craft them in the order that they're listed here, because again, this is across all metas, my opinion on the strength of the card as they exist with all of the cards in the game right now, but not necessarily in the meta that exists right now. And this is how, basically, what you see on the left here is how I sort these, but I've explained this in other videos, so I'm not going to go over it now. Instead, we're just going to roll the intro and jump straight into the rankings.
What a performance there by J King.
J King, full plot armor.
J King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J King is our world champion! J King 7! What? The back-to-back Cards world champion!
Alrighty, so the first elite we have here is the 114th or 144th Infantry Regiment. The Elephant Boys is how they're more commonly known. And it's the 3-3 smokescreen, I think it's ambush smokescreen, and when a friendly destruction effect triggers, trigger it a second time. So basically doubles all of your destruction effects, and it's a very powerful effect that is essentially the only card in the game that does it. There's another card that, I guess there's Duty as a Mountain, but that card's awful. So it's a very powerful effect, but the problem is it's on an elite body, which means, one, it's just difficult to find, so you can't necessarily build your entire deck solely around Elephant Boys, unless it's like a combo OTK kind of thing. But you can't build just like a normal deck around finding Elephant Boys because it's just too inconsistent. Unlike, say, Signal Regiment, which like you can draw at any point in the game and it's going to be probably fine. Elephant Boys, you know, if you draw super late, you've probably triggered all of the destruction effects or most of the destruction effects on board, and it's going to be harder to get as much value out of it. Also, it's fairly easy to remove. It dies to stuff like Carpet Bombing, which, you know, is a bit of an issue for a card that you want to be keeping around. If it was like some sort of permanent effect for the rest of the game, like if it was for the rest of the game your destruction effects trigger twice, that card would be absolutely insane because there's some really powerful destruction effects. It can burn the opponent down really quick, or it can generate a ton of value. Unfortunately, though, it is not any of those things, so it's just never really found a deck. I wouldn't necessarily say terrible, not supported, because I think it's slightly better than terrible, because I think you can just put it in a destruction-themed deck, and when you draw it, it's going to be good, and when you don't draw it, the deck's going to be weak. And I can't really say it's not supported, because it's difficult to imagine cards that would make this card really, really good, just because, again, it's so situational to find, so I'm going to just put it in C tier for situational or weak. Then we have Audacity, and I have to say, when Audacity came out, I definitely slept on this card. I didn't think it was that good. Like, I thought it was a good card. Like, I thought it was like a solid B tier card. And I thought that the only reason not to run it is that you're playing Feigned Retreat with Erados and you have limited orders, and it's not one of the best orders in Jagro. So you just have to cut it, but like, you know, if you were playing Jagro without Feigned Retreat and Erados and like 3 to 4 orders, maybe you would play Audacity. And I stand by not running Audacity and Feigned Retreat Jagro, but as soon as Feigned Retreat got rotated and we started playing other versions of Jagro, man, did I realize just how stupidly powerful this card was. I mean, a big part of it was also them buffing the 2K Aichi that got rotated. That card was insane as well, but this card is just really good on its own. I'm gonna just have to put it in S tier. It's such a stupidly powerful swing on turn 3. I put Autocannon in S tier in the German tier list, and I do think that is just because it's a card where simply if you play Autocannon on turn 3, there's a large percentage of the time you're just going to win the game, and there's nothing your opponent can do about it because it just snowballs so hard. Audacity is one of those things your opponent can do about it. If your opponent plays turn 3 Autocannon, and then you play turn 3 Audacity, and it hits the Autocannon, you win the game. It's just over. Audacity is so insanely powerful early in the game as just a crazy tempo swing, but it's also really good late in the game because the Aichi that it spawns also has Smokescreen, so it's a good way to get guaranteed damage in against control as an aggro deck, just because you can play Audacity, it does 3 damage, but then it also leaves a smokescreen bomber that can then hit face through guard on the following turn, and it will be difficult for them to remove it. So yeah, it's just a solid card, really, really powerful, good at all points in the game. S tier. Then we have Bonsai, and Bonsai is actually a very fun card. It's a 7-cost order, destroy all ground units with 4 attack or less, and that includes friendly ground units. End your turn. So it just says end your turn on the card. And yeah, I mean, the end your turn part doesn't matter a ton most of the time. Like, most of the time, you're like, you're healing and playing Bonsai, or you're playing Bonsai on turn 7. When it does matter is when you want to destroy all ground units on the board and then play a guard unit. You can't, because it will end your turn, and if you play the guard unit before, it will likely die to Bonsai. So yeah, it's a very fun card. It's powerful in Japan Control, but Japan Control obviously is not a particularly good deck. And it's something that you have to think about. You can't just sort of slap it into any deck, because if you're playing a very, like, a guard-heavy deck with, like, lots of Glamour Boys and Osakas or Takasagis, you probably don't want to play Bonsai, or at least it will be much harder to fit Bonsai into your deck, just because, it was going to clear your own units. But yeah, otherwise, it is just a very strong card, but I'm going to have to put it in B tier, where it's a good card. And it can be great in certain decks. The problem is those decks that it is great in are just not good. And that's not they're not good in this meta. That's just there has never really been an amazing deck that was not immediately nerfed into the ground that used Bonsai very effectively. Then we have Bombing Raid, and this might be a bit of a controversial take. I'm going to put Bombing Raid down here in A tier. Just because Bombing Raid has been in pretty much every single Japan deck since, like, the beginning of the game. Bombing Raid is, like, a classic card, so, like, it has existed from the original base set of the game. And, yeah, it used to be 3 credits. If it was 3 credits, it would be back at S tier. But at 4 credits, it's good. It's efficient. It can do burn damage, so it's flexible, but it can also be used as, like, an AoE to take out 3 units in the front line. You can take out 2 units and deal burn damage. It can hit smokescreen stuff. So it's just a very, very efficient tool, and it's very, very well-rounded. But it is never really as game-swinging as, say, an Audacity. Like, also because people will just play around Bombing Raid. It's because it is so commonly used, people actually play around Bombing Raid. So it's difficult to get as efficient as you want. Sometimes it's just like 2 damage to the HQ and you kill a unit, and that's not amazing. Like, it's fine, especially in a Jago deck, but, like, Bombing Raid is often not an amazing card, and I've very frequently had the thought of, should I just cut Bombing Raid for other cards? And sometimes I have, I usually don't. It does feel like around that 35 to 40th best card in Jago. But, and then if you're in a control deck, you obviously run it just because it's really good against a decks like Jaguar. It's just 4 credits, take out 3 units. That is not a Tora and doesn't suck against a control deck. But it just doesn't feel as, like, S tier crazy strong. Like, it doesn't really come with huge tempo swings necessarily. Like, 4 credits to destroy 3 units. Sure, but those 3 units are also probably all, like, 1-drops that your opponent expected to be taken out by an AoE. So it's good because it gives Jaguar a card that it otherwise wouldn't have, but for the spot that it fits, it's not actually an amazing card. It's just good. Then we have Sheon, which is a card that people probably haven't seen a ton of. It's also another card from Japan's base set, but it's a 3-credit, 2 operation cost fighter, 3/3, cannot be attacked by ground units while this unit is in your support line. And then it has the second effect of countermeasures cannot trigger. All countermeasures cannot trigger, friendly or enemy. And this is just a really bizarre card, because the first part of the text is the same as the Pete text, which we'll get to in a bit later. And you'd think that, okay, a card like Pete and Sheon, it's to just put into your support line, and then it goes face, and it's just a consistent card that allows you to go face or get value trades, and your opponent can't deal with it if they're just a ground-focused deck. And then it has the second effect of countermeasures cannot trigger, and Japan doesn't have countermeasures, so that's fine, but it's just super random. And and I believe it dies to Careless Talk, which is kind of hilarious. Yeah, it's not a good card. I wouldn't say it's terrible. Like a 3-cost 3/3 fighter is terrible stats, but the cannot be attacked by ground units while this is in your support line is actually a very good effect. Like this is very solid. Now with the fighter, the Pete is probably better, just because it's a bomber, so it can actually get like value trade. This Seiyun is probably better focused going face. But if you do like turn 3 Saiyan, turn 4 bolster, you get a 5/5/0 op that your opponent can't attack with ground units. That's pretty good. And then the countermeasures can't trigger. That's just like an additional effect. But I would put it in C tier though, because that's not happening, and it is worse than Elephant Boys. Then we have Lightning Conquest. This is a card that has been rotated, and it's a card people think about. They think about so little that I have heard from multiple people, and in my own experience as well, people forgetting that this card was rotated, and going like, "Oh, I just had like this crazy idea for a Lightning Conquest deck," and then they go to actually build the deck, and Lightning Conquest's not there because it was rotated. So it is not get played frequently. But that being said, the fact that people very consistently come back to this card, it's because it's pretty good. It's kind of a combo enabler, so for those who don't remember or don't recognize the card, it's friendly infantry can move and attack this turn, and also are immune to damage. So essentially, infantry can act like tanks, and also they are immune to damage, so they can just trade out with enemy stuff, and you don't have to worry about losing them. It's more frequently used for the infantry can move and attack than it is for the immune, although the fact that it also grants immune is quite good if you just sort of run this in a Jago deck as a big tempo swing. But yeah, it can do really wacky stuff because it can essentially turn Blitz infantry into Blitz tanks, which is particularly good in combination with cards particularly like Bicycle Regiment, which is the 0-op Blitz Fury infantry, because as it turns out, a 0-op Blitz Fury tank is pretty good. So yeah, there's some crazy combo stuff you can do with Lightning Conquest. You can also just throw it in a like infantry-heavy Jago deck, and you're gonna find good value with it. You will also find like a good burst potential with it because suddenly your cavalry regiments can go face from hand, which especially particularly later in the game is sort of where Jago can drop off against control decks because you have very few Blitz tanks. And if your entire board gets cleared by a carpet bombing, you then refill it with infantry, but you can't burn them right away, and then they start playing down guards or AoEs, and things just sort of fall apart. So Lightning Conquest is quite good in that respect. I think it's a good card. It's probably going to be on the lower end of B tier. I think it's slightly better than Situational. It's just kind of like the 40th to 45th best card that you want to put in a Jago deck. So it's never really fit, and during the time of Feigned Retreat it was terrible because it definitely is not an order good enough to fit into a Feigned Retreat deck, but post-Feigned Retreat, I think people kind of slept on Lightning Conquest and then it got rotated, but hopefully it comes back one day because I think there's some interesting things to do with it. Then we have Dena, and my goodness am I glad this card is gone. So Dena is a 3-cost, 1/3 fighter, 1 operation cost, and you don't play it for the body because the body is absolutely trash. You play it for the deployment to draw 2 random 1-cost units from your deck. And when this card got revealed, people were like kind of skeptical on this card. Like they saw it and they were like, it's certainly not bad, but like, is that good enough? Like, drawing 2 cards is good, but it is specifically 2 1-cost units. And you run enough 1-cost units that it's not like a signal finder. But you also run few enough 1-cost units that it's not guaranteed that it will always trigger for 2 draws. And even if it does trigger for 2 draws, it's not finding you your orders, like your expansions or your Feigned Retreats or your whatever. It seemed like a kind of mediocre card. So it was sort of like, do you want to eat that big of a tempo loss by playing a 3-cost 1/3 fighter and including this bad card in your deck just for a little extra draw when you're already playing Feigned Retreat? So you already draw through your entire deck if you hit Feigned. Do you really want Dena? And the answer turned out to be absolutely yes, because Dena will help you draw Eratos, and then Eratos help you draw Feigned, so it just made drawing Feigned much more consistent. It would also thin out your deck to make it more likely to draw into Feigned naturally. And then once Feigned got rotated, and Dena did not get rotated, it turned out it was still good, and then it started to be play in control decks, because control decks started to run Type 94, just the Type 94 TK early. Not the TK early, the Type 94, which was the give a surprise attack, deployment give a surprise attack, and that was just running for control. So you'd actually run like 2 recons, 3 Type 94s, and then you just throw in Dena, and those are your 5 1-drops. And if you hit it, that's good, because you're a control deck, and control wants 3k draw 2 with a body. And if you're not a control and like, even if you sort of hit like 4 of them, and you're much more likely to not draw 2 off of Dena, it's still just kind of fine. Your deck can afford to be inefficient. So Dena is an absolutely cracked card. It's not S tier. It's not a broken card. Like, you're still basically just like, it's better than Bombing Raid. To be completely honest with you, I think Bombing Raid is a more flexible card. But I think Dena is a more powerful card. I think card draw is better than the damage on board in this case. But yeah, Dena, very strong card. I kind of hope it doesn't come back, just because it was just really, really powerful. It also made Jaguar mirrors suck, because if your opponent hit Dena and you didn't hit Dena, like, you know, you'd be down into a top deck war, and you'd have like a slight advantage, and then your opponent would top deck Dena, and then it would just be over. Like, the top deck Dena into like Signal Regiment Recon, and nowadays it would even draw Jaeger regiments and stuff. Yeah, Dena can stay gone. Then we have Desperate Measures, which is a 2-cost to deal 2 damage to all enemies. You lose a credit slot. So this card came out in the first ever Cards expansion, and it was absolutely cracked. And then for whatever reason, it never got nerfed. It was run in every single Japan deck. It was probably the best card in every single Japan deck. Desperate Measures was the only card you were certain of never cutting from Feigned Retreat Jaguar. People played 2-order Feigned, and by people I do include myself in that. We played 2-order Feigned at certain points, and Desperate was the other order. You would never consider single-order Feigned Retreat, just because Desperate Measures was such a stupidly powerful card. There was all, like, a non-zero, like, probably like 20% of games where you would actually rather get Desperate Measures than Feigned Retreat. Well, sorry, there's more than 20% of the games where you'd rather get Desperate Measures than Feigned Retreat off of, like, given a random draw. But, like, there's 20% of games where you would actually win off of Desperate Measures more so than Feigned Retreat. Like, Feigned Retreat wouldn't really, like, affect your win condition, whereas Desperate Measures single-handedly won you the game. It's just a stupidly powerful card, and it's actually better than Audacity, just because 2 damage to everything for 2 credits is such a ludicrously powerful tempo swing. It is good at any stage of the game. It is good when you are winning. It is good if you are losing. It will easily turn around games from absolutely dead loss to winning with the flip of a coin. Desperate Measures, absolutely insane card. And now it also has the self-credit denial synergy, although that deck's kind of fallen by the wayside after the nerfs. And then I've said a lot about Feigned Retreat, and most of you will probably know what Feigned Retreat is, but some of you might not if you're newer to the game, because this card has been rotated for a while. But Feigned Retreat is a 6-cost Japanese order. Discard your entire hand. When you deploy a unit this battle, draw a card. And that wording is about to be changed to give your HQ when you deploy a unit this battle, draw a card, but the effect is the exact same. So essentially, how you would play Feigned Retreat in a deck that I helped pioneer, and honestly was probably my like first contribution to competitive cards, was you would just play Jagro, and instead of running Feigned Retreat alongside expansions, which is what a lot of people did, is you just play Jagro, and then you would play Arado, which is the 1/2 German fighter that when you play it, if your opponent has more units than you, you draw an order from your deck. And then you would play like 4 orders in your deck. I originally did 2 Enigmas, Desperate Measures, Feigned Retreat. And then I realized 2 Enigmas was bad, but I wanted to add Bombing Raid, so the 4 orders was Bombing Raid, Enigma, Feigned Retreat, Desperate Measures, and then we eventually realized that there's not really a point of playing Enigma. So then it went to Desperate Measures, Bombing Raid, Feigned Retreat, 3-order Jaguar, and then some people started putting in Audacity to go back to 4 orders. But yeah, Feigned Retreat is just an absolutely crazy card, because you get Feigned Retreat off on turn 6, you discard your entire hand, although your hand is probably like 1 or 2 cards, and they're probably both pretty mid, and then for the rest of the game, you draw a unit, and you play it, and you draw another card, and because your deck only runs 4 orders, with the intention of making it more likely to draw Feigned Retreat off of Errado, it also means that your deck is almost entirely units, which means every single time you play a card, you draw a card, basically, and that means you just have access to the entire rest of your deck. It's almost like your hand is full of your entire deck for the rest of the game, and obviously, fatigue becomes a factor, but because your entire deck is just like 1-drops with Blitz, you basically just build a full board, your opponent has to clear it, you build a second full board, your opponent has to clear it, you build a third full board, and then your opponent dies, or they're able to clear it, and then you, like, eventually die in fatigue, and that's on top of just having, like, the turns 1 through 5 regular J-Gro start, that sometimes will just roll over an opponent if they have a bad hand. Feigned Retreat, possibly one of the strongest cards ever released in the game. This effect is just so utterly game warping. Now, unlike Desperate Measures, Feigned Retreat really fits in only one category, like one archetype, and not even just archetype, it really fits into only one deck. Like, you put 2 Errados, you put Feigned Retreat, you put Desperate Measures, and then you say, what are the next 30, like, what are the 35 best Japanese and German cards I can put in this deck? And that is basically it. Like, as new expansions came out, everything would stay the same, except, like, you would take out the weakest Japanese or German cards and put it if there were better Japanese and German cards released in that expansion. So Feigned Retreat is incredibly one-dimensional in that way, whereas Desperate Measures is just an auto-include in every Japanese deck ever. And there was ways to beat Feigned Retreat. Like, it wasn't the best deck in the game. It was very, very consistent, but it was never really, like, completely and utterly dominant in a way that, like, say, post-Feigned J-Pro was, actually, after they rotated Feigned, but also rotated a bunch of other cards. In that, I guess that would have been Winter 2023? The Brothers in Arms expansion. After they nerfed Island defense. After the expansion dropped, they rotated Feigned, and then they nerfed Island's defense, and J-Gro was just absolutely dominant and crushed every other deck in the game. And that was without Feigned Retreat. So yeah, also without Desperate Measures. So I think Desperate Measures might be slightly better than Feigned Retreat, just because Desperate Measures is good in every situation in every single deck. Always. You would just always take a Desperate Measures. Whereas Feigned Retreat, it creates an incredibly powerful deck. It, like, single-handedly creates a ludicrously powerful deck. But, you know, I think Desperate Measures is probably slightly better. Then we have Home Defense, which is a fun and somewhat silly card. It is an 8-cost order, which costs 4 if your HQ has 10 defense or less, and it adds a tank to your board, and it adds an Aichi to your board, both to your support line. And the Aichi is the same Aichi summoned by Audacity, so the 3/2 smokescreen, that gets +2 attack if you have other Aichis. And the tank is the Chinu, which is the 5-cost 4/5 tank that has ambush and guard if it is in your support line. And the way it spots, it will always be next to your HQ. So yeah, it's essentially summon a 4/5 ambush guard and an Aichi for 8 credits, or it's 4 credits if you have 10 health or less. So this is obviously just a card that fits very nicely into Japanese control. But the issue with this card is it doesn't do anything. Like, there's no tempo. And if you're at less than 10 health, you're probably, like, you would rather clear the board than summon a guard, just because it's so easy to get through guards with various pieces of removal, or suppression. So, you know, if you can clear the board and play home defense for 4, that could be very, very good, but that's not always possible, because Japan doesn't have the best board clears, or they don't have the best cheap board clears, necessarily. And then, if you're playing against control, like, it's just sort of value. Like, it's similar, I guess, to Tractor Factories, where it's just an 8-cost summon 2 units, just a value generation card. But Tractor Factories, those cards have Blitz. Now, obviously, that's worse if you're against an aggro deck that has the front line. You'd rather have the guard. But if you're against a control deck, it falls off really, really hard. Also, again, like Bonsai, Japan control is just not that good. That being said, it used to cost 10, and then be 5 if you had 10 or less health, and then they changed it to 8 and 4, rather than 10 and 5, and it's a lot better this way. But again, I think it falls into the category of Japan control has never really been good. Like, obviously there was Japan Discard and Japan France Resistance, but those are both sort of asterisks next to the Japan control, and neither of them ran home defense. Um, so yeah, it's probably got to be high C tier, low B tier. Um, I think I'd have to put it in. Well, we'll leave it in high C tier, but you know, it's sort of on the line, and we might move it later. Then we have Isolation. This is a very fun card. It's a 2-cost order. Target unit is removed from the battlefield. Return it at the start of your next turn. So immediately you think of this as like, oh, it's just like a Jagro get around a guard card. So it's 2 credits, remove any unit. So it's basically like Sendai Regiment on for 2-cost order. But it returns it at the start of the next turn, but if you're killing them, it doesn't matter. So, you know, if they play down like a Grenadier Guards, and then you play 2-cost Isolation, the Grenadier card goes bye-bye, and then all of your units go face and you win the game. That's sort of, I think, the intended reason, like the intended use of this card when it was created, and that's kind of how some people used the card. It saw a ton of play right when the expansion dropped, and then it sort of fell off pretty quickly because people realized that actually it's very difficult to consistently be able to just one-shot your opponent through an isolation. You'd rather just have Sendai to permanently remove the unit, well, at least semi-permanently remove the unit from the board. And also all of your cards have 0 operation cost anyways, so the 2 credits extra for Sendai doesn't really matter. You would rather have Sendai because you could afford to pay the 2 extra credits if you're going to kill them through the guard anyways. But you'd much rather have the card not come back. Also, then Feigned Retreat Jaguar took off, and Isolation definitely is not an order worth putting into Feigned Retreat. But I theorized a different use case for this card, and I played around with it a little bit, and then Gorkyu brought the same idea to the OCC, and he might have won with it. But basically the idea is you use Isolation on your own unit, and I'm obviously not claiming to have like been the first person to think of this. But you play Isolation on your own unit to guarantee its presence on the battlefield on the following turn. So basically, it's kind of like cheating out a unit. It's like a Japanese version of cheating out the unit, where you have to pay the full price of playing a big unit, and then you play Isolation, and then on the following turn, it reappears on your board, and you still have your, like, 12 credits. So it's essentially a way of cheating out a big unit that takes an entire turn, so it's a very, very inefficient method of using it. But if that unit is Kawanishi, what you can do is you play Kawanishi, you play, like, a Tora Tora or a Desperate Measures to do a big, buffed up board clear, and Kawanishi is a card that we'll get to in a second, but it's all of your orders deal 2 extra damage. So you play like Kawanishi, you play a board clear to wipe the board, and then you play Isolation to make Kawanishi disappear so your opponent can't kill it, and then on the following turn, Kawanishi reappears, and then you kill your opponent with some sort of elaborate, semi-elaborate OTK, using orders that are now buffed up their damage by Kawanishi. And it's a really fun archetype. It was never that good, though. Japan just simply doesn't have the same stall tools as Soviets or Britain. But yeah, it was a really fun combo to try regardless. But yeah, it does sort of fall off a little bit. That being said, I think Isolation is still just a really solid card. And, you know, it can get rid of, like, pincer effects, it can get rid of, just buffed up effects, on top of, like, getting through guards. Yeah, it's... Isolation, I think, is just still a very solid card that I think other nations might consider, like, a little bit more, if they had access to, maybe. But yeah, I think it's probably better than Home Defense, even though Home Defense has probably historically seen, like, a bit more play in fringe decks. I think Isolation, as just a high tempo card, cards with high tempo are generally more usable than cards that generate value. Then we have Jade Division, and this card used to absolutely suck. And then they buffed it, kind of, question mark. So basically what Jade Division is, it's a 5-cost, 6/6, elite infantry. Obviously it's an elite, but a 2-up infantry, 5-cost, 6/6. So already it's kind of bad. I mean, we've seen 4-cost, 6/6, 1 operation cost, just vanilla. So the effect better be crazy, and the effect is gets +1/+1 when you play a Japanese card, and it gets guard if it gets +10 attack. and it used to be gains Fury if it gets plus 10 attack, which was bad and nobody ever played it, and then they changed it from Fury to Guard, which honestly seems like it would be kind of worse, because any deck that has played this is probably a aggro deck, not a control deck. Like, you'd probably want to play this in some sort of, like, J-Gro, where, you know, all of the rest of your deck is just, like, one cost, like, expansions, or maybe you could include it with Feigned Retreat, so, like, you play Feigned Retreat, then you slam down Jade Division, and then play, like, 21 drops, and Jade Division just becomes this massive behemoth. The issue is, Cards is not a game where you win off of one very big unit, because every single nation just has so many ways of dealing with one very big unit, particularly a slow-moving infantry. And yeah, it's also a card that takes up space in your hand. And unlike a other 5-cost card that you run in Jaggro like Sheon can come down and deal 11 damage from your hand, whereas Jade Division needs to come down, and then your opponent has a chance of removing it, and then you push it to the front line, and then your opponent has a second chance of removing it, and then it's still not that good unless in the meantime you are also playing a ton of cards, and then also, wouldn't you just win the game if your opponent doesn't have removal and you're playing a ton of cards? Yeah, Jade Division is a terrible card. This is going to go into the first D tier card. It's just, like, actively not really a card you would want to play in your deck. I suppose there's an argument to put it into high C tier, just because it's a unit, and, like, you know, if you're drafting a deck, like, if you're playing draft, like, you would pick Jade Division over other cards, for example, just because a 5-cost 6/6, it's a body. Like, if you're just playing, like, a sort of, like, Pauper-esque format where it's just a ton of vanilla units hitting back and forth, Jade Division is fine. The problem is, Constructed does not work like that whatsoever, and never will work like that. So, I want to put it down in terrible just because it's a card that will never see play, unlike, say, Sayun or Elephant Boys or Home Defense, which reasonably could see play. But, on the other hand, you know, if you have, like, no collection and Jade Division is your first elite, still put it in your deck. But yeah, I should probably just put it down here in terrible. Then we have Kawanishi, which is the aforementioned your orders deal +2 damage. It's a 7-cost 1/7 bomber. The stat line on this I always found kind of funny. The 7 cost makes sense because the effect is really powerful, and the 7 health makes sense, just because you want it to have some staying power, although you mainly want to use this card to get its effect off immediately, but, you know, it sticking around is good. The 1 attack I always just found really funny. Like, the idea is they don't want you running this card for its body. You want to be running this card for its effect. But the 1 attack 2 op is just so feels bad, man, if this ever does stick. Like, it does literally nothing. So it's a card that you obviously have to build your entire deck around. And if you do build your deck around it, it can get a ton of value. I think this card is a bit of a bait in that a lot of people will build a lot of really bad decks because they see the potential of what you can do with Kawanishi. The issue is, doing that stuff with Kawanishi is not that good. At the end of the day, Cards is just a much faster game than it used to be. Like, people might think of the heyday of Japan-France Resistance, where Kawanishi would, like, if you could discard your opponent's Kawanishi, like, you'd wipe your brow. But these days, like, Kawanishi, if your opponent is at a point where they can kill you with Kawanishi, it probably means you're losing the game, because if a control deck can heal out of range where that would really matter, and an aggro deck should have won the game by the point Kawanishi becomes relevant. So it's not a fantastic card. I'd still put it in B tier. Like, it's not a bad card. You can certainly build decks around it. And yeah, but man, it's just kind of hard to use. I guess the fact that this card will only get better as more orders are added to the game, we'll put it into low A tier, just because you can build a deck around it, and it should, in theory, get better as you go. The issue is, there's the 4 cost, your orders deal 1 more damage, and you have to play a critical mass of orders in the same turn for it to be worth going for the Kawanishi. Stuff like Last Rites. And stuff like Last Rites is, I don't really see that strategy expanded greatly. So yeah, Kawanishi sort of low A, high B. We'll leave it here for now. Then we have the K83, and this is a very fun card. So the K83 is the 4 cost 6/5 fighter for Japan, so it's basically like an unnerfed Dragon Slayer. And then it also has the added effect of, at the start of your turn, you draw an extra card and your opponent draws 2 extra cards. So obviously it's giving your opponent card advantage, but it's drawing you an extra card. It's not at the start of your turn draw your opponent an extra card. It's draw you 1 card and your opponent 2 cards, but you don't really care about your opponent drawing 2 cards in a multiple situations. One, if you're an aggro deck, and you're just trying to get deeper into your deck so that you can just flood the board and kill your opponent, and your opponent's playing like some crappy control deck where they're playing like 1 card a turn and it doesn't really matter. 2, if you're playing a control deck that revolves around your opponent overdrawing, like forcing draws or your opponent having big hand sizes, so forcing your opponent to draw is actually beneficial because you're destroying cards in their deck. And yeah, those are basically the 2 situations. Either forcing your opponent to draw is actively a good thing that you are trying to do, or you don't care about them drawing cards because it's a card that's also drawing you a card, and if Dragon Slayer just said draw a card at the start of your turn, you would absolutely run it, and that's basically all you read on this card. So yeah, K83, absolute beast of a card. When this came out, this was probably the single best card in the game. Not card, but the single best unit in the game when this came out. And then it ate a nerf, and then it was still one of the best units in the game, and was just a staple of J-Growth that, like, if it came down on turn 4, certain decks just immediately lost the game. Like, you would keep K83 in your opening hand sometimes, because it was just like, oh, I played against Soviets, I play K83 and they lose. So yeah, is it an S-tier card? It's certainly gotten a lot worse in that every nation has gotten more ability to remove K83, and other decks have gotten better and more efficient, so other decks, even control decks, are going to be more able to use the 2 cards that they get, and because control decks have more access to removal for K83, you are now drawing them into that access to K83 removal. So it's certainly not as good as it used to be, and it will probably only continue to get worse. However, it started off as being the best card, or the best unit in the game, so I probably kind of have to leave it, well, I think I have to, actually, honestly, I think I have to put it down here as the top of A tier. It's simply not as cracked as of a card that it used to be. Japan also kind of struggles to make, like, Japan has access to a ton of draw in a way that they didn't used to with Feigned Retreat. Because before, like, getting 1 card deeper into your deck meant 1 extra chance of finding Feigned Retreat, and if you find Feigned Retreat, you win the game. These days, Japan just has a ton of cards that draw 1 or 2 cards, so you don't really need key as much. Like, you sort of have, like, a consistent flow of cards throughout the entire game, rather than looking for specific cards that give you access to the entire rest of your deck. So yeah, K83 down here in A tier. Then we have Kika, which is a 7 cost, 3 operation cost, 6/5 fighter, so same stat line as Ki, but this card has, the K83, but this card has Blitz, and Destruction. Shuffle 4 Kamikazes into your deck, and the Kamikaze is a 1 cost order, which says deal 1 damage to the opponent HQ, draw a card. So, if you think about it, it is kind of like a 10/5 fighter, except it's not, because that's not how the game works. Now, obviously, this card was playable in something like Tony OTK, because, you know, this has 3 operation cost and Blitz, and that deck ran Bolster and Burst of Fire, and if you play Bolster and Burst of Fire on this, it goes up to 10 attack and Fury, so it just one-shots the opponent. Even in Tony OTK, I think this was somewhat skeptical, because, you know, you're running Tonys, and Tony's just better than Kika. And then you run Heon's, and Heon's is better than Kika because it costs 2 less. And then people would sometimes run this in control decks, and I think that was just strictly wrong. And I did that myself for a while, just because it was like, oh, you know, everybody's doing it, it's a Japanese elite, and it's a good Japanese elite, so you throw it in a control deck. Honestly, it was wrong to play Kika in the deck. Kika is a massive bait, because the 6/5 stats on a Blitz plane is really, really not that good for 7 credits, 3 operation cost. Like, Heon costs 2 less, and it is -1/-1. Like, for 1 less attack and 1 less health, you can play a card for 2 less credits, and when you're talking about a card that costs 10 to attack and operate, that's turn 10 versus turn 8 to attack and operate, which is a very, very big difference. It also means that you have 2 extra credits to work with on that turn versus 4 extra credits to work with on that turn. Sheon is just better than Kika most of the time. And what the other big difference, obviously, on Kika is Kika has the destruction effect, shuffle 4 kamikazes into your deck, and that can be really, really good, but it can also just be an actively bad effect, because it means you draw kamikazes instead of other cards, and then you have to play the kamikazes, and if they're doing anything short of killing your opponent, it means you're just losing credits. Like, it's not card draw, because it's adding the cards into your deck and then taking them out. And it just means you have to then spend an extra credit on your turn to draw the card you actually want to keep playing, the card you actually put into your deck. Now, obviously, you might just kill your opponent with the kamikazes, and in that case, Kika is fine. But very, very few decks would actually be able to consistently draw through their deck, where you would be able to play something like Kawanishi, all the kamikazes. And if you wanted to do that, you could just instead play Last Rites. The other situation where Kika was fine was in stopping fatigue, because you would shuffle the 4 kamikazes into your deck, and then you would never play them, so you would just add 4 cards to your deck, so you would stop taking fatigue for 4 turns. And that was pretty good, but again, there was very few decks that could realistically get a good use out of that. So Kika saw play in way more decks than it ever really should have, but its effect is still very good, but very niche. So I would put Kika down here in B tier. And honestly, pretty low B tier. I think it's better than Isolation. Maybe better than Lightning Conquest, but it's certainly worse than Bonsai. It's just very few decks can realistically use it well, and the decks that can use it well are simply running it as just like a, well, I might as well, because Last Rites and Kawanishi really take the cake, and Kika's just like, you know, a little bit of icing. Now, speaking of Last Rites, Last Rites is a 3-cost Japanese order. Shuffle 8 kamikazes into your deck. So these are the same kamikazes that you get off of Kika, so they're 1-cost orders, deal 1 damage to the enemy HQ, draw a card. And similarly to Kika, you can either use this to shuffle them into your deck and try to burn down your opponent, or you could use them to stop fatigue. And I think when Last Rites was printed, this is a base card set, or this is a base set card, so I can't be certain about this. But I'm pretty sure that when they designed Last Rites, the idea was that for this to go into Jagro, and Jagro would just play Last Rites for a bit of a tempo hit, but then they would have 8 extra burn over the course of the game, if they could draw into it. And the reason you never played this in Jagro is because you can't take that tempo swing, and Jagro just had better access to better burn cards that didn't require you to wait a long time to actually get them. So yeah, it never really saw play in Jagro, and in the base set, Japan Control didn't really exist. Like, it kind of technically did, but no, it really didn't. And then, in after a couple of expansions, when they released France, and then France would be like a very sort of burn-heavy, high-unit type deck with a lot of force draw for the opponent, and then you would use Last Rites to finish off the opponent with Sirens, but that was an okay deck. And then Kawanishi came out, and then that deck got a whole lot better, because you would go into the bottom of your deck, like you would draw through your entire deck, and then you would play Last Rites, so that your deck is just 8 kamikazes. And then on the next turn, you would play Kawanishi, and then you would play kamikaze, and it would guarantee draw you into another kamikaze. So you would just play Kawanishi, and then you'd play 5 kamikazes, and that was 15 burn damage to the opponent, and that's pretty good. And if they can't remove Kawanishi, then you have an additional, how much would that be? You'd have like an additional 9 burn damage from the kamikazes, and then if you have the Kika, that's like an additional 12 burn damage from the kamikazes. And that turns out to be a lot of burn damage. Or what you could do is, if you've managed to deal with all of your opponent's units through your countless AoEs and single target removal and the force draws to just make them continuously overdraw huge amounts of their deck, if you both reach fatigue, you just don't actually play the kamikazes. It doesn't matter how much health they have. If they have like 70 health, no, you'll never be able to burn them down with kamikazes. But what you can do is just simply play Last Rites and then pass. and your opponent is just out of units. They can't kill you, and they will eventually just die in fatigue, even if they have a massive health advantage, because you can stop fatigue for 12 turns with Last Rites plus Kika. So that was sort of how Last Rites was worked. Obviously, there was also the combo I've talked about previously, where you could do Kawadishi Isolation, and you could do like Kawadishi Isolation Last Rites all in one turn, and then on the following turn you could play 8 Kamikazes in a row with Kawadishi on the board for 24 burn damage. But yeah, Last Rites, very stupid card. I kind of dislike the design of this. Well, that's not true. I am indifferent about the design of this. They nerfed Night Witches because they didn't like stopping fatigue and they didn't like long matches, and then they never nerfed Last Rites. And like now it got rotated, so it's fine. And they nerfed the decks that ran Last Rites into the dirt. But I was always kind of peeved that they like kept Last Rites around for whatever reason, but they nerfed my beloved Night Witches. So, you know, I have a messy relationship with the card Last Rites, but it is very good, and it's better than Kika because it actually does create a deck. So I would put it up here in A tier because it is the central card for a lot of decent decks. And it's substantially better than Kawanishi. I would say, like, obviously these two cards work in conjunction quite a bit, but in general, I would say Last Rites is substantially, like, you would much rather, if you could only run one of them, you would much rather run Last Rites. So yeah, maybe I will put Kawanishi down here in B tier. And just leave Last Rites up here at the top of A tier, because it is a very powerful card, even if it's not necessarily run in very powerful decks anymore. Then we have Pete. And Pete is the bomber version of Seiyun. It's a 2-cost, 2-operation cost, 2/2 bomber that cannot be attacked by ground units while this is in the support line. End of text. So it's literally just like the Seiyun text, but it doesn't have the additional effect of the countermeasures. But unlike the Seiyun, it's a bomber, which means that it can actually just continually hit units for the entire game if your opponent doesn't have removal for it. Now, unlike Seiyun, it's a 2-cost, 2-health unit, so a lot of cards kill this that don't kill Seiyun, like Sudden Strike, like Through the Breach, like United We Stand. So, yeah, it's not going to stick on the board the entire game, and the 2-operation cost means that, honestly, you're not going to be able to keep up with the value trading. It's just going to kind of suck. So it's like a worse Aichi, the 2-cost Aichi. And now Aichi is, like, one of the best cards that have ever existed. But, you know, it's substantially worse than Aichi. I think this card is better than people think it is. Like, this card is, like, never seen play in anything competitive. Ever. But despite that, I actually think it's, like, not a bad card at all. I think it's probably, like, I should realistically put it down here in C tier. But I think it's much better than the Seiyun. And I think it's, like, sort of in that within the top 50 cards of a lot of decks. The issue is you need to be within the top 40 cards of the 40 best cards of a deck to ever see play. And I don't see anything changing that's going to necessarily push Pete into that. But, you know, it could happen. So we'll put it down here in C tier, probably above Elephant Boys and definitely above Seiyun. Then we have Radiant Brigade, and this card is stupidly strong. So Radiant Brigade is the... everybody knows what Radiant Brigade is, but it's the 3-cost 2/2 Blitz Infantry deployment destroy target enemy unit with 2 or less attack. Radiant Brigade is just going to go straight up here in S tier. It is an insane card. It makes a lot of cards really, really bad, like certain guard cards, low attack, high health guard cards, bad, because you run those cards to be good against Jagro, because all of Jagro's units have low health, so a low attack guard can work against them. The issue is, it's like, well, if I spend my entire turn playing, like, say, the Churchill, the 2/7 heavy armor guard, and they play Radiant Brigade, I lose the game. And that's kind of an issue. Radiant Brigade is also really powerful on curve, similarly to Audacity. And it's also very good at taking out certain cards with Smokescreen, like the Engineers Battalion, for example, from Soviets that can stop just the infinite pain train of healing. Or like opponent signal regiments in a Jagro mirror. Radiant Brigade is just a very, very useful card. It's also great in control because it can just very easily go 2-for-1 against an aggro deck. By playing it, you destroy one aggro unit and then you trade it into another aggro unit in the front line. Radiant Brigade is just an incredible card. I would put it under Audacity, but it's solidly an S tier. If this card, if there's ever a Japan deck that you really wouldn't want to run Raiding Brigade in. Then we have Rule the Skies, which is a 2-credit order. Give the enemy HQ. If this HQ has taken 3 or more damage this turn, give all of your air units +1/+1. So it's Japan's HQ card. And in theory, this could be very powerful, because Japan has some decent air units. And we have seen Japan Air exist for a brief window of time, and they did run Rule the Skies. And it could sometimes pop off. If you have 4 air units in the support line, and you play Rule the Skies, and then you hit the opponent for 3, you give all of your units +1/+1, and that's, you only need to trigger it once if you're getting it on like 3 or 4 units for it to be really, really good. And the fact that it stays up permanently, it's a permanent threat of being able to continuously buff all of your board. The issue is, if you're playing Japan Air and you had a board of 4 units and the ability to go face, you probably won the game like 100% of the time, and would win the game within like a turn or 2. So Rule the Skies didn't super matter. Like, it was still a good card in Japan Air, but there's a reason Japan Air was not previously very popular, and it's because the archetype isn't super well supported. If this was a British card for 2 credits, it would absolutely see play, but it's not. And even if it was a British card, it wouldn't see, like, it wouldn't be that good. So I think I'm gonna leave Rule the Skies in B tier, because it is a very high potential card. But it sort of suffers the issue that all of the enemy HQ damage cards deal, which is you have to... It's a tempo loss to play it, because it does nothing when you play it, and then it's an additional tempo loss to hit the enemy in the HQ rather than doing anything else with your turn. So it's 2 huge tempo losses to trigger the effect once, and unlike the other ones, this is the one that can sort of best snowball, because it can, you know, theoretically give +9/+9 if you have 9 air units on the board. But so it is probably the past Road to Berlin. This is probably the second best HQ card. Maybe. But again, it's just for a deck that's not that good. So we're going to leave it down here at the bottom of B tier. Then we have Sheon, which is everybody's favorite ambush blitz fury fighter, of course. 5 cost, 3 operation cost, 4/4. And Sheon has just been kind of a staple in basically every single Japan deck since, well, Classic. And it's come in and out of certain decks, but it's just really good. You can just slam it down on turn 5 as a threat, and it can end games against aggro really quickly, because aggro can struggle to deal with Sheon. And then you can just be like, well, yeah, you're an aggro deck and I'm a control deck, but if you can't kill Sheon, I'm just gonna kill you in like 3 turns. Or, you know, you run it in Jagro, and Jagro can similarly play it on turn 5 as a threat, or you can play it on turn 8 as 4 burst, and a threat, you can play it on turn 11 for 8 burst, and that probably ends the game, if it hasn't already ended, and it sort of gives Japan something to look forward to later in the game after all of their one-cost blitz units have fallen off very, very hard, and the opponent's still not dead. You just eventually draw into Sheon, and you know, you wait until turn 11 and you hit him for 8. So it's a very, very good card. I wouldn't put it S tier, despite being played in every single Japan deck. I think it's played in every single Japan deck, but I don't think it's that great in every single Japan deck. In fact, I even don't think it's great. Like, I don't think it's I don't think it's as good as these 4 cards in S tier are in any Japan deck, let alone every Japan deck. And Desperate Rush's Audacity and Raiding Brigade are great in every Japan deck. So it's gonna go down here in A tier. It's probably slightly better than the K83, just because played on curve, Sheon is a much bigger threat. Just because, honestly, like, 6/5, it's so easy to guard up, and then K83 is suddenly just drawing your opponent cards every turn, and gives your opponent an advantage. Or, like, they just keep pinning it or something. Whereas Sheon is just a threat that always has the risk of just killing your opponent. So yeah, Sheon gonna be down here in A tier. Then we have Signal Regiment. Signal Regiment, just a very powerful card. It's... Everybody knows what it does. When a friendly minion dies, or when a friendly unit dies, deal 1 damage to the enemy HQ. It is a central card in Jagro, and it's also seen play in, like, certain mid-range decks as well. Even some control decks, just because, like, it's just kind of good. Like, you're willing to spend a credit on a card that will eventually kill your opponent, because even if you're playing control against aggro runs no healing, and you're going to be trying to, like, spam out guards and blitz units to trade as quickly as possible. And, if you just start with a turn 1 signal that your opponent will kind of struggle to remove anyways, you could very easily burn out a Jago deck, or at least bring them low enough that you can kill them within a turn or two with a big unit. Signal just a very solid card. Now, is it an S tier card? I don't think so. Dealing, in the classic set, yes it was. Because it was really hard to remove, and, there was one nation that had any real healing. At the point of the game now, there is so much access to healing now, and also there's so much access to removal for Signal Regiment now, that, often, obviously you're never going to run a Jaguar deck without Signal Regiment, but, there's often times where you don't even keep Signal Regiment as your opening hand, and, there's certainly times where you don't play Signal Regiment on turn 1. That's sort of, a fault a lot of people go for, where they just try to greed out on getting as much signal damage as possible. But it still definitely gives inevitability in certain matchups, so it's certainly at the very least high A tier. I just don't think I could justify putting it into S tier, because there's so many times where, Signal might deal 8 damage over the course of the game, but you just still lose the game, because Signal never affected the board, it gave you 0 tempo, and, dealing 8 damage from a 1-drop is really, really good, but if it doesn't kill the opponent, it didn't do anything. If you don't win the game, it didn't really do anything. So it is definitely up here. Honestly, I'd say it's better than Sheon. Probably the highest A tier card here. Then we have Soul of Old Japan, which is the Japanese choose one of 3 random Japanese elite units to add to your hand. And Soul of Old Japan sucks. It's probably the second worst one after the US. It might even be worse than the US, because at least the US can run greedy ramp lists, and if you're a super greedy ramp list, you'll just run a few good men, and then you slam it, and then you pick the biggest thing. The Soul of Old Japan just really, really sucks. Obviously, there's certain things you can try to get, like a second Signal Regiment, or a second Raiding Brigade, or a second Sheon. But there's also, most of the time, it's going to be like, do you want Yokosuka, Pete, or the Elephant Boys? And it's like, I don't want either, I don't want any of these 3 cards, and also they kind of don't really do anything when you play them. Japan has really 1 or 2 good tempo units. Most of Japan's really good cards are in the form of orders. So Soul of Old Japan really, really stinks. It's never seen any play in really anything, and even Japan control decks do not lack for value. They just really wouldn't want to run this card. So yeah, we're gonna put it down here. It's certainly better than Jade Division, but I do think it's worse than Seiun. Then we have To the Last Man, 10 credits, destroy all units. This is actually a very fun card. It's a very good card. Obviously, it's a staple of Japan control. And yeah, there's not a ton else to say about this. It's a card that's too expensive to run in anything other than Japan control, but it's one of the few cards that make you think, I want to play Japan control. So it's probably an A tier card. Is that even true? It's powerful, but there's not a ton of cards to compare this to, I suppose, is the issue. But it's destroy all units. And if you compare this to, say, Kyber Bombing, which is 7 credits, deal 3 damage to enemy units. Now, obviously, 3 damage is not destroy all, and this can destroy anything. And, this is really good against certain decks that just, dump a ton of stats. Like something like Ramp running, Mass Deployment, or, a Printer deck that gets, a ton of ISUs on the board and stuff. To the Last Man wipes everything, but most of the time, a Carpet Bombing is probably just good enough, and then you're playing 10 credits, and also you destroy your own units. Gets a little awkward. And then if you're playing certain decks, like, say, Japan-Poland Legions, which is quite strong, you just have access to Uprising, and Uprising is basically just 5 credits to the Last Man. So, yeah, to the Last Man, it's good, but it doesn't make Japan control. That's very obvious, just because of how little Japan control exists. And it's really difficult to run outside of Japan control, and it's very easy to imagine this card getting power crept by just more efficient things that do a similar effect, or see this card get buffed in the future, maybe down to 9 credits. So yeah, I would leave it at the top of B tier, maybe. Then we have Type 96 AA gun, 3 credit, 2/2, 1 operation cost, artillery. And it's one of Japan's few artilleries, and when An enemy deploys an air unit, reduce its defense to 1, destruction, draw a card. This card is seen a dotted play in Japan, just because, 1, people play air units, so it's a really annoying unit to get around, and 2, it's just a 3-cost 2/2 ID, which is not terrible. And if your opponent kills it, you draw a card. And just anything that says draw a card that is a fine body, it'll probably run in Japan. Well, specifically Jagro. And outside of Jagro, it's not that good. So yeah, and it's not crazy. It's really easy to remove. And drawing a card isn't like the end of the world. So it's like a solid B tier card. And honestly, I'm kind of realizing that like it feels like there's kind of this B tier should include, like, maybe I should move a ton of this B tier down into C tier. Like, maybe I'm putting too much stuff down in B tier, so, like, maybe we'll move, keeping the order, move this down here. Because, yeah, this feels like a bit more fair. I do think these cards are quite good, though. But AA Gun is probably a bit more playable than Kawanishi, but, it's down here. Like, it's just a fine card. It's a card you run because it's fine. It's not a good card. Then we have Admiral Yamamoto, which is a 1-credit Japanese order. Give friendly air units on the battlefield +1 attack and blitz this turn. The fact that this is on the battlefield and not just give friendly air units +1 attack and blitz this turn is kind of bizarre. It means you have to play all of your units and then play Admiral Yamamoto, which is weird. And also, basically, every Japanese air unit that you would want to give Blitz has Blitz, with, like, the exception of Frank, if you're doing some weird Franco TK. So, yeah, this card is just not that good. And then 1 credit for +1 attack, if you just ignore the Blitz part and just say 1 credit for 1 attack. It's not that good either. To be completely honest, this card is absolute trash. Yeah, this is probably Japan's worst elite. Then we have Yamato, not to be confused with Yamamoto. And Yamato's a 4-credit order. Your Japanese units get destruction, deal 2 damage to the enemy HQ. And this is a card that people briefly experimented in Feigned Jagro, just because it was like, oh, well, if if you're drawing like 30 Japanese 1-cost units to play over and over and over, that's a perfect turn to have Yamamoto in your hand, and that is true. Post-Feigned, with like a 3 or 4 card hand, and like an 8 Japanese unit board, Yamamoto would be very, very good, because Yamamoto becomes 4 credits, deals 16 damage to your opponent, through guard. The problem is, Yamamoto has to be in your deck from the very beginning, and that makes Arados worse. It just makes your mulligan worse, it makes just your entire deck worse up until you are in that situation. And in that situation, you're probably winning without Yamamoto. And then if you're not playing a Feigned Retreat list, it's kind of difficult to get enough Japanese units where you're, again, wanting to play this. You'd just rather play stuff like Lightning Conquest or Blitzkrieg or something like that. So Yamamoto is just really not that good of a card. Let's put it down here with Elephant Boys, maybe. And then we have the first Yokosuka, which is a 2-cost, 1 operation, 1/3 Blitz Fury Infantry that gets +1 attack for each 0 operation cost unit you control. And honestly, like, this card should be good. Like, it should be fine. Like, it should be on the the Type 96 AA gun level of card. Just because Fury is a big threat, even if most of the time it doesn't get to attack twice. It is just a threat. It can be good defensively. If your opponent has the front line, you can play down a couple 0-op units, and then you play this as a 3/3 and take out 2 units. It should be fine, but it just isn't. Like, it's not that people don't try this card. I at least have consistently tried to make this card just fit it in to just a normal Jagro deck. Obviously, you can't build around it. But just try to fit it into a normal Jagro deck, and it's just not good. It's just worse than Akita, and Akita's worse than 51st Recon, and 51st Recon is not even a card that you consistently run. Japan just has better 2-cost cards to put in Japan, and it doesn't really want 2-cost cards, because why would you run 2-cost cards when you can run 1-cost cards? So yeah, that's kind of the issue with Yokosuka. And I'm now realizing that I forgot to add the new elites into this tier list. So give me 1 second. Alrighty, so here's the elites from the last 3 expansions. In no particular order. We have the Jake. So Jake is the self-credit denial card. When you lose a credit slot, give all of your units +1/+1. It's a very powerful effect. Unfortunately, its self-credit denial has eaten a ton of nerfs, and it's difficult to have a board and then also be denying credits on the same turn. Like, I know I disagree with this with other people. Like, Jake can sometimes single-handedly win games in self-credit denial. I do not find that that happens remotely often enough for this to be, like, say, an A-tier card. It happens enough that you want to put it in your deck, but it doesn't, like, it's not the main win condition of the deck. And there were certainly times when self-credit denial was at its best form, before the nerfs, that I considered even taking out Jake, because it was like, is it actually good enough that, like, because there was just so many times where I had to draw Jake, and it would be like, oh, I don't have access to the credits, because I keep denied myself credits, to be able to play Jake, and play units, and then also deny credits, unless I was doing the one roof pop-off turn, and if I was doing the one roof pop-off turn, I'd just play the Great Expanse instead of Jake, and, win. So yeah, I think Jake is probably a B tier card. I'd put it above Yokosuka, below AA Gun. I think there's even maybe room to put Jake in regular Jagro, because regular Jagro runs Desperate Measures, and you might run 2 copies of Commit the Reserves, and 3 denied yourself credit cards. It's not amazing, and you definitely don't want to run anything beyond those 3. But maybe those 3 is just enough to run Jake in regular Jagro? Question mark, maybe. Probably not, but like maybe it's worth experimenting. I don't know. Then we have Carrier Battle, which also came out in the same expansion as the Great Expanse and Jake, which is the most recent one in Covert Operations, and it has seen substantially less play. It's 3 cost, deal 3 damage as an order, so it can deal 3 damage to anything, so it's sort of a better from the people, a better air blitz. You can deal 3 damage to the HQ, you can deal 3 damage to a unit. The downside is it adds Carrier Battle to the enemy hand with the numbers upgraded, so it means it adds a 4 cost of deal 4 damage to the enemy. And they can use that to deal 4 damage to your HQ or deal 4 damage to your units, and if they do that, then you get the one that deals 5 cost for 5. The issue is, your opponent's not going to play the card unless it's really, really good for them. And there's a way to look at that and say, like, okay, well, if my opponent doesn't play the card, then it's just a 3 credit, deal 3 damage, which is good. I don't even know if, like, just 3 credits, deal 3 damage would be good enough to play in Jagro. I straight up don't even know that. But, like, it's like, oh, it's a 3 cost, deal 3 damage, take up a spot in my opponent's hand. But the issue is, it eventually will be good for your opponent, and, like, it will allow them to make a play that is quite good against you. In a way that either it wins them the game or giving you +5, deal 5 damage is just not something that they care about. So it just never really ends up working. And the whole fill the opponent's hand with stuff archetype is somewhat long gone due to the reserves of all of the resistance cards and take initiative. So it has potential to come back. I definitely think it's better than certain other cards. It has a decent chunk of potential. Unfortunately, it's just not there at the moment. And looking at this list, I think I want to make a couple changes. I think I want to move Bonsai up, move Yokosuka down, and then swap. Yeah, something like this. I just really think Kika's not that good. And yeah, this seems like a pretty alright way of moving things around. Then we have Kokura's Sword. And this card is a very difficult card to evaluate. So it's a 5 cost, 2 operation cost Japanese infantry. And by a difficult card to evaluate, I mean it's actually very easy, but it's sad. So it's a 5 cost 6/6 elite infantry, so it's the same body as Jade Division, but a very different effect. Kokura's Sword effect is a destruction effect. If it's the enemy's turn, add a random Japanese, I think it's add a random Japanese ground unit to your support line with this ability. So across all Japanese ground units, it will add a random one to your support line that has the destruction effect if it's the enemy's turn, do the exact same thing. So essentially, it's a way to have an infinite unit on the board if you never trade it out, because your opponent will they'll kill Kokura's Sword, and then, they'll have to keep killing the things it gets back until you get a bad enough unit that they ignore it. But the problem is they can't ignore it forever if they're a control deck. If they're an aggro deck, like, they just take the front line and kill you, but you don't play Kakura Sword against an aggro deck. You play it against a control deck, particularly order-heavy control decks, because they will just never be able to get rid of it, unless they have supply shortage. Or, like, they get a huge unit and force you to trade into it. The issue is, this card came out in Brothers in Arms, and in Brothers in Arms, this card was absolutely cracked and saw a ton of play. Part of that was because this card was ludicrously broken. There was like a hilariously broken deck, a hilariously broken bug with Kakura Sword that basically allowed you to get infinite, like any unit that had a destruction effect would trigger Kakura Sword twice for some reason. So it very quickly let you get like 2, 3, 4 cards with the Kakura effect on it, which made you win the game immediately. But since then, they added the suppress mechanic. And the suppress mechanic means that you play Kakura Sword, and then they suppress it. You play the 5-cost 6/6. And it sucks. Yeah, just suppress makes this card absolutely terrible. Like, I would put it into A tier before suppress came out. Now that suppress is out, it has to be in C tier. Like, there's certain decks, like Soviets, don't have access to suppress. And this could be quite good against, like, a Soviet deck until they play Depths of Winter. Like, there's just so many answers that were released to Kakura Sword and, like, the expansion or two that came out after it. Yeah, it's just very sad. Honestly, I think I'd pull it here between home defense. And maybe I should just put all of these things back into B tier. I'm very undecided on that. Then we have On the Ascent, and On the Ascent is a very fun card. So On the Ascent is a 3-cost Japanese order. Destroy and salvage all units with the lowest attack on the battlefield. So essentially, it finds whatever unit has the lowest attack on the battlefield, and then it will destroy all units of that attack on your side and the opponent's side and salvage them. And this is a very difficult effect to evaluate how good it is, because your opponent can play around it, and also you have to build your deck around it to a certain extent, or you have to play around it to a certain extent. So there's a lot of times where you have the greatest or you have On the Ascent, and it's just like, if my opponent, like, if this unit wasn't on the board, On the Ascent would be crazy. Or like, if this unit had one less or one more attack, On the Ascent would be crazy. And the problem is that happens so frequently compared to the number of times where On the Ascent is crazy. And a big part of that is people have just learned to play around it. They're like, oh, when playing against Japan, don't just play like 7 units of the same attack, because they'll play On the Ascent. And even when they do, it's like a big board swing, but like unless they play in Finland, the salvage effect doesn't really matter most of the time. So it's just sort of like a weird AoE. And people ran it in Jaggro for a while, but myself included, but I cut it from Jaggro, and I think other people are starting to cut it from Jaggro as well, just because it's really bad with Signal Regiment. Like, you can't play On the Ascent after playing Signal Regiment, unless your opponent, like, removes Signal Regiment, and then it gets just really awkward to play, because anytime you have units on board, those will be the smallest attack units on board, because all of your units have small attack. In Control, it's good, but again, kind of difficult to use, because your opponent can play around it. But that being said, even the threat of this card existing, it's still good enough that you put it into your deck, because even if it's just destroyed one thing, like your opponent just plays like a big unit, they play Leopold on it and return all of your units to your hand, and you just play On the Ascent and take the Leopold. Because if they don't have any units on the board, it's the same as, is it Modi Tactic? I think Finland has like a 7-cost destroy a unit, salvage it. On the Ascent is just 3-cost destroy a unit, salvage it if it's the only unit on the board. And that happens at a pretty frequent amount of the time. So I would put On the Ascent into A tier. I would say like maybe, yeah, between Last Rites and Bombing Raid. It's just like a solid card that you could run in the control deck. Maybe even like a little bit better than Bombing Raid. Then we have Shenano, and Shenano before the nerf would probably be here. Maybe even, yeah, it would probably be just one under Desperate Measures. It was very similar to Desperate Measures, in that it was essentially 3 credits destroy the entire board, but you don't lose the credit slot. And also, like, it could just sometimes, like, deal, like, 10 damage to the opponent as HQ. Unfortunately, they nerfed the card, and now it's quite mediocre. So its current version is distribute damage to enemy targets equal to the total number of units on the battlefield. It used to be number of cards on the battlefield, so it would basically be +2 because it would count both HQs. So it would always deal 2 more damage than it does now. And it turns out dealing 2 more damage on a 3-cost card is pretty important. So Shenano is just... It's still fine in certain decks. Some people run it in Jagro. I don't super love it in Jagro. I run it in Japan, Poland Legions, because that deck's a bit slower and bit more about building a board, and then you can play it against Jagro. It's a really fun card, because it's a card that you want to run in Jagro, because Jagro runs a ton of cheap units to flood the board and get the Shenano numbers very high, but it's also a card that's very good against Jagro, because it counts their units against them, and also all of their units have 1 health, so Shenano's much more easily takes out all of their units. But yeah, at the end of the day, Shenano, it's not that good. But like, it's still not terrible. I would still put it into B tier maybe. But yeah, it's just kind of a weak effect. Yeah, we'll put it here maybe between Kawanishi and Yokosuka. Then we have Storm Dragon. It's a 9-cost 5/4 bomber with destruction effect to destroy all units. And this card sucks. So a couple of reasons why this card sucks. First of all, it's 9 credits in Japan. So it's bad. Second of all, Suppress exists now, so it's not even like you can play it on turn 9 and threaten the opponent. But even if you could, like, even if Suppress didn't exist, you still play this, and then your opponent can either choose to trade into it immediately, or they could choose to go all face. And if they go all face, you're left with a 5/4 bomber. But the issue is, it's very difficult for you to trade this off. So if your opponent just goes all face, it's kind of difficult for you to trigger the destruction effect yourself if they don't have fighters. And if they're going all face, it means that they're not on 5 health, so it's not like you just simply win the game by going face with the bomber. And at any point, they can, if you then need to start playing guards because you have a Storm Dragon on the board, but they're not killing it and going all face, and you just play a ton of guards, then they can kill Storm Dragon and your Storm Dragon kills your guards. And it's not even like you can play Storm Dragon and then trigger the destruction effect without killing the Storm Dragon. Like, it's not destroy all enemy units, because then you could do, like, Storm Dragon and then Fortunes of War and trigger the effect, destroy all enemy units, and then keep Storm Dragon on the board. It's all units, so if you trigger the destruction effect, it will then kill Storm Dragon and then destroy all units a second time. So, Storm Dragon's absolutely awful, and it also ruins cards like Soul of Old Japan, or Experimental Flight, cards that give you Japanese elites, or Japanese elite air units, because Storm Dragon is just that bad. It's even worse than Admiral Yamamoto. It is a card that you actively do not want basically any time. The only good situation is like if you somehow Ural Factories or like Red Banner into Storm Dragon and then can kill it in a situation where you need to clear the opponent's board and have no other like cards that can do so. But again, that never happens. Then we have the Zero, and Zero is a fun card that when it got announced, people were very unsure of how to evaluate this card because it's a 6-cost 4/3 fighter, so very, very, very high cost, very, very low stats, very easy to remove, kind of, but the effect is the first card played by the enemy each turn costs double, and that is a lot. So if you play this on an empty board, it's really, really difficult for your opponent to remove this, because suddenly Carpet Bombing costs 14, and you can't play Carpet Bombing. And, you know, if you play it on turn 6, and it's like, oh, well, I'll kill it with Lion for a day, but now my Lion for a day costs 8 credits, and my La Dechuba costs 14 credits, so I can't kill it with either of those things. Now, the issue is, if you do have units on board, they just immediately trade it out, and then you did 6 credits to do absolutely nothing. But if they don't have units on board, this card can get really, really crazy really, really quickly. The issue is, you played Japan and you need the opponent to not have units on board, and even if they don't have units on board, they can settle sometimes, like if they just have like a 1-cost card, you know, they could like play a 1-cost card for 2 and then remove it with whatever, and it really only costs them 1 credit. So yeah, Zero is not that good of a card. I'd put it down here in C tier. I actually just think this card's kind of bad. I know a lot of people have tried to make it work. Then we have the Great Expanse, which its current version is a 4-credit order. Set your credit slots equal to your opponent's credit slots, and give all of your units +1 attack for each slot gained. It used to be give your units +1/+1 for each slot gained, and if it was still in that version, this card would be up somewhere around here. Unfortunately, it doesn't do that anymore. Now, +1 attack, if you're just going to immediately kill the opponent, this card is just as good. The issue is, more often than not, you would use it to, like, you know, make a board that's of, like, 50-50 worth of stats on, like, turn 7, and most decks couldn't remove that early in the game. And now the health stays the same, and most of your units have 1 health. So now you do the Great Expanse, and if you don't kill the opponent immediately, you're probably losing all of your units, and then losing the game. That being said, it is still the core card of Self-Credit Denial, and Self-Credit Denial is still a solid deck. So we're going to leave the Great Expanse up here in A tier. Just because, like, you know, it is just a pretty solid deck. And that is it for now, or not for now, that is the end of all of the Japanese elites. Again, I'm still kind of unsure about this B tier. Maybe I should just make one really, really big B tier. Because some of these cards, it's, like, good enough, but, like, where's the line between good but not auto-include and, like, weak? Hard to say, but I'll just leave it like this. But again, that's just my thoughts. This is not a crafting guide. I know that I have a couple hot takes in here, so let me know what you think of this. Let me know how you would change things around. You're welcome to join my Discord, link in the description, and you can then fill out and post your own tier list for people to talk about, or just discuss this tier list with other people in the Discord. And thank you very much to everybody who has donated to the channel. It helps a lot. If you would like and are able to donate, there is a link in the description. And that is going to be it from me for this one. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch all of y'all in the next one. More videos coming soon.